Hello and welcome to Theology Matters. This is Dr. John Clark. And today we want to finish our teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. And in order to do so, I want to just kind of briefly bring you up to speed. Again, this is Jesus speaking to a Jewish audience, an audience that he's offering to establish the kingdom to. He says the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That's been the message of John the Baptist in chapter 3 and also Jesus' message in Matthew chapter 4. Before he engages in this teaching. And so this is an audience, had they received his message and received him as king, would have been the exact group that entered the kingdom. And so he goes over initially the Beatitudes. He describes what the kingdom's values are going to look like. And this would have given his audience some key marker points, knowing what kingdom he was speaking about, the kingdom that was prophesied in the Old Testament. And then we came to really the key to the interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount. That's in Matthew 5:20, where Jesus says, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven." And then Jesus then went on to give really errors in 6 different interpretations that the rabbis held, that the Pharisees and the scribes held in his day. Errors because they did not reflect correctly the righteousness of God. They reflected the best righteousness that man could offer. Man often focuses their righteous efforts on external compliance with a total disregard for inner compliance or anything to do with pure motives or heart thinking, those kind of things. They just disregard those things. Jesus makes the point that God's righteous standard takes into account even thoughts and intentions and motivations. And so God's righteous standard is much higher than the righteous standard of the scribes and Pharisees. And so Jesus uses some common interpretations of the law of that day to show that the people had heard the Pharisees teach this, but Jesus tells them that the righteous level is different. The righteousness level is different than what they were saying. Then he goes on to describe 5 hypocritical behaviors that the Pharisees were engaged in. Again, reflecting their lack of attention to inner spirituality, proper motives, right thinking, etc. Just focus on external compliance. And so he goes through about 5 different hypocritical behaviors through the beginning of chapter 7. And now to close out the sermon, Jesus is going to give 3 pairs comparison, comparing 2 things. And he's going to give an example in the midst. And so the pairs comparison, the first one we looked at was 2 gates and 2 ways. Today we're going to look at the two types of teachers and then 2 kinds of builders. And then he's going to give us an example of both the false prophets and the narrow gate and way with a quick example. So let's go on to the second pairs comparison. We find that in verses 15 through 20. Jesus says, "Beware of false prophets." This is Matthew 7:15 through 20. "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them." And so in every age of human history, even starting in the Garden of Eden with the serpent, there's truth and error. Teachers of both sides try to influence people with their message, and Jesus simply warns of this possibility. In fact, the presence of false teachers is one of the reasons that the way which leads to life is described as difficult in verse 13, because there's so many distractions, so many arguments from majority even. Hey, we all believe this, and that guy over there, he's weird. He's teaching salvation by grace through faith. And there's almost this pressure to go with the majority rather than to go with the truth. Now, it's very important as Jesus describes these 2 pairs. Again, I believe he's got the Pharisees in mind when he's describing this. Again, the Pharisees, who would have been viewed by that culture as the most righteous people in the culture, and yet this is the way Jesus is describing them. And notice how the false prophet is described here. First, it's very important to notice that their outward appearance looks good. The text tells us that they're wearing sheep's clothing. They come to you in sheep's clothing, verse 15 says. And so this means externally they look good. They look like a genuine religious leader. They look like maybe even a true disciple of God. And so it's very important to note with false teachers, even transdispensationally, is they typically look good on the outside. And that was specifically the case for the Jewish audience of Jesus in this sermon. Second thing he describes them is that inwardly they are ravenous wolves. So even though they look good on the outside, appear to be a genuine disciple, they are completely dangerous. Their ultimate goal is their own success, and they don't care who they will harm in the process. And so we see the two descriptions so far. They look good on the outside. Inside, they're very dangerous. They're like ravenous wolves. And then the third thing that Jesus says about them, this third description, is that they can be known by their fruits. Very commonly misinterpreted, misused, misquoted verse for some people who claim that this verse teaches that you can know whether or not somebody's a Christian by what type of life they're living. That's not what this verse is talking about at all. In fact, who can be known by their fruits? Well, we're talking in context about false prophets. And what's the fruit of a false prophet? It's definitely not their life. Why? Because they look like sheep. You couldn't tell anything by their external life because they look like genuine disciples. So the fruit's not even their life. We're not even looking at their life here because they look like the real deal. No, their fruit is their false teaching. When a prophet or a teacher's teaching or his prophecy does not line up with the word of God, they are to be rejected as producing false fruit and being a bad tree. Now, Jesus is going to give an example here in verses 21 through 23 of both false prophets and the narrow gate and way. He's going to describe this a little bit. He's going to kind of flesh this out for us a little bit. And so in verse 21, he says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, 'Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.'" And so in following up his warning about false prophets, Jesus now goes on to describe the people who look good. He describes them as people who are not assured of entering the way of life or the narrow gate. And the reason for this is that it is not dependent upon how one looks. It's not dependent upon what one does, no matter how religious sounding, but rather whether or not someone knows the Lord. How do you know the Lord? Well, via faith in him, faith in Jesus Christ, the one who died for you and rose again. And notice in verse 22, he uses the word many, and that many should trigger what he said back in verse 13. "For wide is the gate, enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it." Verse 22, "Many will say to me in that day." So you see he's tying this back to verse 13 and that wide gate. Again, notice in verse 23 that the Lord views their religious works and accomplishments in his name even as lawlessness. And this fits so well with other scriptures that teach us that good works actually hinder your approach to God in terms of establishing a righteous standing for yourself. Isaiah 64:6 says that all our righteousness are like filthy rags. And so this is exactly borne out here. Again, this is not, as some people so mistakenly use this passage for, this is not speaking of a believer who just says they're saved or who just believes in Jesus but then doesn't do any good works. A lot of people will use this passage. They'll say, "Oh yeah, you can't just say, 'Lord, Lord.' You can't just say, 'Oh yeah, I accept Christ,' or 'I believe in Jesus,' and go to heaven. You got to do his works as well." What's so ironic about the use of this passage for the teaching is that these people were saying, "Lord, Lord," and then they were doing religious works in his name. These people that are condemned, that are going to have to depart from Jesus because they're practicing lawlessness, are actually religiously active people who are actively engaged in good works. So the whole use of this passage in that way is completely faulty to the context. Again, Jesus is illustrating how false prophets will not go to heaven, how it's difficult to enter the narrow way, that there's a narrow gate. And the reason for this is many think that they can obtain or attain heaven through their own righteousness, through their own deeds. And so Jesus gives an example of how that's not going to be the case. Now, finally, Jesus gives his third pairs comparison with two kinds of builders, and that's found in verses 24 through 27. Jesus says, "Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who's built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." And so Jesus now addresses his audience and leaves them with an illustration representing the two types of responses to his teaching. Verses 24 through 25, the one who hears his teaching and responds to it positively is likened to a wise man who built his house on the rock, was able to withstand difficult weather. This represents safety and security. But in contrast to verses 26 and 27, the one who hears his teaching and does not respond to it positively is likened to a foolish man who built his house on the sand, was not able to withstand difficult weather. Again, this represents the opposite, the lack of safety and security. And this is truly a dangerous state to be in. The one who builds his house on the rock foundation represents the one who responds by faith to Jesus and his teaching of righteousness by faith. This person will enter the kingdom. In contrast, the one who builds his house on the sand foundation represents the one who trusts in their heritage, their circumcision, their religion, their good deeds to obtain their own righteousness. This person will not enter the kingdom and will either die during the tribulation period or be sent to hell prior to the kingdom. And so verse 28 and verse 29 gives us an indication of the response to Jesus' sermon. And it also shows us that although this message may have started with the disciples in mind, it expanded to a larger group of Jews in his audience. So verse 28 says, "And so it was when Jesus had ended these sayings that the people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, not as the scribes." And so the response of his audience was astonishment. And this word means to strike out or to force out by a blow. It came to mean the sense of knocking one out of his senses. We would say they were blown away. They were actually just blown away by his teaching. But why was this their response? Well, specifically, it's given that in contrast to the scribes who tended to quote other rabbis, Jesus taught them as one having authority. His teaching was with conviction and given in the power of the Holy Spirit. So that concludes the study of the Sermon on the Mount. But again, as a couple of concluding remarks, it's very important to remember what the context is for the Sermon on the Mount as recorded in Matthew 5 through 7. And also remember that as we study and read and listen to teaching on this sermon, we've got to remember to keep the interpretation front and center before we start jumping in trying to make applications to the church age. Very important to just be very disciplined in our study there, always remembering that the interpretation was always Jesus's original intent for his original audience. What was going on then? What was that original intended message? And then at the same time, after we get the interpretation, recognizing when there's some transdispensational, cutting across all ages and time, righteous principles that still would apply today in the church age, and just being very careful as we attempt to do that.